Hey everybody. This week we're going to talk about Joseph in the Old Testament, not Jesus' daddy. This story of the story of Joseph's life is found in the book of Genesis. His birth is told in, I think, Genesis 30, but the main part of his life is told in Genesis 37 through 50. Now, I'm not going to read all that today. I'm going to hit some high points though. Joseph is the great grandson of Abraham. Abraham had Isaac, and then Isaac had twins, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob is Joseph's dad. So Abraham had been promised, he would be the father of many, a great nation. The Israelites would be God's people, and Abraham would be the father of that. Well, so Joseph has heard those stories and knows his family heritage because that was what they did. When he was 17 years old, he was one of the youngest children. He had 10 older brothers. And he was probably a little bit of a smart butt because he was his dad's favorite and everyone knew he was dad's favorite. His dad had made him a coat of many colors that was special and different than all the other brothers, and I think Joseph probably used that to his advantage a lot. Well, he had a couple of dreams, and he told his brothers and his dad about these dreams that they would be bowing down to him one day. Well, that made the brothers even madder. So they decided, first of all, they thought about killing him. But they knew that would hurt their dad really, really bad. So instead, they decided just to sell him into slavery. And then they just told their dad that he had been eaten by a wild animal and had died. Dad still thinks he's dead. What's the difference? Anyways, when he was sold into slavery, he was taken to Egypt and he was bought by Potiphar, was the man's name. And while he was there, he did everything the way he was asked to do, and he moved up the ranks in Potiphar's household and became the head of his household, right under Potiphar. He was the one in charge of all the other servants. His wife told a lie on him, and he was put in jail. So this is a very bit much a roller coaster ride. Dad's favorite, sold into slavery, moved up the ranks to head servant, goes to jail. While he's in jail, again, the Lord was with him, and he did everything the way it was asked of him, the way God would have him to do it, and he moved up the ranks in prison to where he became head of all the prisoners. While he was head of all the prisoners, he interpreted a couple of dreams for some people in there, and those dreams came true the way he said they would. They forgot about him, though one of them was killed and one of them got out and went back to Pharaoh's house. But he forgot about Joseph, who had interpreted his dream. A couple more years went by, and Pharaoh had a dream. Now, Pharaoh is the man in charge in Egypt. Pharaoh is a term similar to, we say, president. There were multiple pharaohs throughout time. The Pharaoh we talk about when the Israelites come out of Egypt, different guy than who this is, okay? So Pharaoh had a dream, and he was trying to find somebody to interpret his dreams. So he asked around, and the guy who had been in prison with Joseph remembered, oh yeah, there's a guy in prison. Let's go get him. So they bring him to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asked him to interpret his dreams. And this is in Genesis 41, verse 16. Joseph says, I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. So he's basically telling Pharaoh, it's not me who interprets your dreams. God will give you the meaning. So Pharaoh tells him his dream, and he actually had two dreams. And Joseph says it's really the same dream, just given to you in two different ways. You will have 7 years of abundance, of great flourishment here in Egypt. But after that, there'll be 7 years of famine, 7 years of drought and not having anything. So Pharaoh decided, well, we need to find somebody who can prepare us for the 7 years and can take care of us. And they decided that Joseph would be that guy. And so Joseph is now 30. So he's been a slave and in jail now for about 13 years. So at 30, he is put in charge. He is directly under Pharaoh. He is put in charge of the whole land of Egypt. He is given a wife. He is told that he's in charge. Like, nobody can say anything to him. Pharaoh trusts him that much. So while the 7 years of abundance, they decide we're going to collect 1/5 of the grain that everyone has. You got to give it to us. We're going to hold it. We're basically putting it aside and holding it because we're going to need it in 7 years. So they took up so much grain and had so much of abundance that Joseph couldn't keep track of it anymore. It was unmeasurable. It was not to be calculated. So when the 7 years are up, they have plenty of grain, but now there is a famine. And Joseph is now in charge of distributing the grain back out. The people didn't just get to come back and get what they donated to begin with. They had to pay for the grain. So to begin with, people had money to pay for the grain. Well, his dad and his brothers, remember them? They still live outside of Egypt in another country in a land called Canaan. But they've heard, there's grain in Egypt. Let's go to Egypt and get some grain. So the dad, Jacob, sends some of his brothers. There was the 10 older ones that he sends to Egypt to get grain. They have no idea that Joseph is there and that he is in charge of giving out the grain. There is one younger brother, his name is Benjamin, and he stays back with Dad because he's now the favorite and we can't have anything happening to him too. So 10 brothers come to Joseph and get grain. Joseph immediately recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. They're not thinking that he's alive. They didn't think he would survive being a slave. And even if he did, how would he have made his way to Pharaoh's people? So they didn't recognize him at all. But Joseph starts asking about their family. How much grain do we need to send? Is your father still alive? Do you have any more siblings? And he's asking questions, trying to find out about his family. Did they do something with his little brother too? Did they get jealous of him? Or have they changed in the past 13 years? Well, now 20 years. And he finds out that his dad's still alive, Benjamin's still alive, and he has to, a few times throughout the story, he has to walk away so he can just cry. He's so overwhelmed by emotion. So he gives them the grain and sends them back home, but he keeps one of the brothers and says, I'm going to keep him until you bring Benjamin back. I want to make sure y'all are really not lying to me. You're on the up and up, because they were strangers in that land. And so he is making sure they're really getting grain for his family, because they've saved all this grain. He's just not giving it to anybody. It's what the brothers think. He's really just trying to find out. So when they get back, Dad says, Benjamin ain't going. We'll just not have grain. Well, then they got to where they still had no more food, and they talked Dad into letting Benjamin go back with them. They asked for more grain, and Joseph brings them in, has a meal with them, and finds out more about the family, and then sends them back, or starts to send them back. But he has another test for them to see, what are they going to do if I try to keep Benjamin here? And the brother whose idea it was to sell him into slavery said, no, I'll take his place, I'll stay here for him. And Joseph realized that they have truly changed. They're not the same people they were 20 years ago. And so he tells them, it's me, it's Joseph, I am your brother. And that's in Genesis 45. And he automatically starts giving credit to God for everything that's happened to him. He says in verse 8, so then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of this entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all of Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near to me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and your herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. So he's telling them, I want to take care of y'all. There's 5 more years of this. Y'all leave our homeland and come here to Egypt. Pharaoh okays this and says, yes, bring them here. I love Joseph so much. Whatever he wants, I'm going to give it to him. So he gives them land for the family to reside on. And remember, Joseph has now 11 brothers, and they all have families. So this is quite a large piece of land and place for their livestock and their people to live. And Pharaoh gave them that. In Genesis 46, when they get back to their dad and tell him, he's a little uneasy about moving. Chapter 46 says, so Israel set out with all that was his, and when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Jacob's name had been changed to Israel at this point. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Here I am, he replied. I am the God of your father, he said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation. And I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. Then Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's son took their father Jacob and their children and their wives and the carts that Pharaoh had sent to transport them. So Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt, taking with them their livestock and the possessions they had acquired in Canaan. Jacob brought with him to Egypt his sons and grandsons, his daughters and granddaughters, all his offspring. Then it lists all the offspring, and later in that chapter it says there was 70 of them total in Israel, and 70 Israelites in Egypt when you counted Joseph, and now he has 2 kids. This was a change for the dad. God had promised him the land of Canaan. God had promised him to live there and This is your promised land. But now God's telling him to leave it. He was scared. It's hard to move. I'm lucky I've always lived right around here. But when I was young, I was in about 3rd grade. My daddy came home and said he had an opportunity to move to Huntsville to work there. And I politely told my mom and daddy I wasn't going. I would live right here with my grandparents. I'd live some with his parents and some with her parents, and I'd visit them every once in a while. Or they could come here and visit me. But I wasn't going. I can understand the fear that Jacob had, leaving his land, his home, and everything he had known. But God reassured him by promising to go with him and to take care of him, that this was part of his plan. You know, many times we face new situations or new surroundings or things that happen to us and that frighten us or that make us fearful. In this time that we're in now, all this change, I don't like it. And some of it has made me fearful. And I know it has many other people as well. And it's normal to experience fear, but it's not normal to be paralyzed by that fear. So we have to make sure we're trusting God and his plan and not letting ourselves be paralyzed by what's going on around us. You know, I'm terrified of snakes. I've been praying a lot about that lately because that fear keeps me inside the house this time of year a lot. I'm trying to pray about that and not let that paralyzing fear, because that fear is kind of me questioning that God's going to take care of me. God created that snake. He can protect me from it. I still don't like them. And I'm still a work in process about that. But this time at home, when I could be out doing so much, I've let that fear keep me inside. And so this section here, and the commentary I read about it kind of touched me right where I needed it to, that God's going to take care of me, even in the face of a snake. And I need to remember that. So whatever fear is holding you back, God's going to take care of you. Don't let it paralyze you. Just like he was with Jacob going into a new land, he will be with you going through whatever fear you're going through. So they get to Egypt. They get their new land that Pharaoh has given them. While they're there, the famine is continuing for 5 years, and the grain that they had saved, people ran out of money to come buy grain. So they had to start buying the grain with their livestock. And then people ran out of livestock. So they had to start buying the grain by giving up their land. So by the time this famine was over, Joseph had acquired all this land, all this livestock, and all this money for Pharaoh. Now this Pharaoh, this man, loved Joseph and loved his family, so it wasn't a big deal because they were treated great. But as years pass, new Pharaoh comes into play, and he doesn't care about Joseph. He doesn't care that the Israelites that are still there are Joseph's descendants and Joseph's family. After Joseph died and a new leader, a new Pharaoh came into play, things started changing. That Pharaoh was greedy, and he was afraid the Israelites would take over, and he made them all his slave. And that's how the Israelites got into slavery in Egypt. God had a plan, and part of his plan was to send them to Egypt, to protect them, to give them food so that they could survive this drought, this famine. But while they were there, God didn't say he would protect us from all the bad stuff. He said he'd be there with us through it. And so after they'd been there a while, hundreds of years later, is when the Israelites got fed up with it, got Moses, put him in charge, the plagues came, and they made their way back out of Egypt. If you ever get the chance, read Joseph's full story, because I skipped so much to get to the main point, but you needed to know some of the background. Joseph's story parallels Jesus a lot. He's the one who went before them to save them from the famine. In the last chapter of Genesis, which is chapter 50, the dad, Jacob, dies, and so the brothers are all scared. Joseph is going to, that he was just taking care of them because of their dad, and that he's now going to kick them out. But I love Joseph's response, and I'm going to read that to finish up. This is verse 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. What his brothers intended for harm and what his brothers intended for evil turned out to be the very thing that saved them in the long run. And Joseph realized that. Joseph saw that. He could have been someone who said, "No, no, no, boo-boo, you screwed up a long time ago, now you have to work for me forever." Or, "Handle it yourself." But he didn't. He was forgiving. He showed grace and mercy, just like Jesus shows to us. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Those things that happen to us, that other people intend to harm us, could be just the thing that God uses to bring him glory, to show others who Jesus is, to save people, either literally or to show Jesus is so he can save them from their sins. So whatever your story is, use it for God's glory. The bad stuff that's happened, God got you through that. He was right there with you, just like he was with Jacob coming to a new land. So use what God has done for you as your story. It's meant for good. Be like Joseph, forgiving. We're spending a lot of time with our families, and those we love the most are sometimes the ones that hurt us the most. So be forgiving. Show mercy and grace. But that is how the Israelites got into Egypt. It was all part of God's saving plan. If they hadn't have came to Egypt to get the food, God's chosen people, the Israelites, would have perished in Canaan. So it was his way of saving them. This virus could be his way of saving people from something now. We don't know what that is yet. It may be years down the road, but good will come from this. I've already seen some of it. I want to close out in prayer. Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for the blessings that you've given us. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for being with us and protecting us even when we're afraid. Lord, I ask you to be with each youth member, wherever they are, whatever's going on right now. Touch them in a mighty, mighty way. Protect them. Put your shield of protection around them. Let them know how much you love them, Lord, and how special they are. Lord, I just thank you for loving us. We ask these things in your sweet name. Amen. Y'all have a great day. I love you guys.